When one says Lewis and Clark, we all instantly know who and what they're talking about. They explored the United States some time ago, and other than that, what else is there to say? Well, over 200 years after their exploration, the men are grouped together as one and the same. But who is Lewis, and who is Clark? And why these two men in particular to do such a journey? All these questions and more are answered in this episode of the Chronicles of Time. I'm your host, Rachel Payton, and let's dive in to the Lewis and Clark expedition. There was this giant chunk of land spanning 900,000 square miles right in the middle of the present-day United States. This land had been the interest of so many countries and had been traded between a few of them. The land was referred to as the Louisiana Territory, and it was a hot commodity. Originally, the land belonged to the French, but during the French and Indian War, it was surrendered to Spain. Years later, it was returned to the French, but one man had his eyes on it. That man was President Thomas Jefferson. In 1803, Jefferson and future President James Monroe successfully negotiated a groundbreaking deal. They secured 827,000 square miles of land for $15 million. That is a massive win for two reasons. It doubles the size of the United States, and it only cost us a bargain of $18 per square mile. The Louisiana Purchase would go down as one of the best deals in history. Now that we have all this land, we must explore it. No telling what is out there in the unknown, or who. For centuries, people believed there was a northwest passage of water that would connect to the Pacific Ocean, so President Jefferson was desperately hoping to find this. He would ask Congress to finance an expedition into the new territory bought in the Louisiana Purchase, and they would approve to do so. President Jefferson appointed his personal secretary and White House roommate, Meriwether Lewis, to lead the expedition. At 29 years old, Jefferson thought of Lewis as the perfect man for the job, writing, "Of courage undaunted, I would have no hesitation in confiding the enterprise as commander and starting preparations for the journey." At the time, a trip like this was like going to the moon. He would study astronomy, zoology, and maps to guide them through the terrain. But knowing how giant of an expedition this would be, Lewis knew he would need a co-commander. He would choose William Clark, 4 years older than himself and once his superior. The two men already shared a bond. Clark would be responsible for much of the precious detailed map work that came from this trip. The two men had pretty varying personalities. William Clark was very level-headed and easy to get along with, whereas Meriwether Lewis was sensitive, moody, and lived in a sense of melancholy. But you know what they say, opposites attract, and the pair made an excellent team. Two men on such a vast journey wouldn't cut it. They would need a team of men to accompany them. So the winter of 1803 was spent prepping hunters, French boatmen, and soldiers. These men would pledge to the success of the journey, even if it cost them their lives. To ensure the men behaved responsibly, punishments were given out if rules were broken. Among the men was William Clark's slave, York. He was the only African American on the trip. The men would go down as the Corps of Discovery and were about to go on one of the greatest expeditions in history. On May 14th, 1804, the Corps of Discovery left Missouri on boats with several tons of dried goods. Meriwether Lewis wrote, "I could but esteem this moment of my departure among the happiest of my life." During the beginning of the trip, the Corps of Discovery had several members get punished. One got caught sleeping on the job, one was caught trying to leave the expedition, and others got caught drinking while on duty. What exactly was their punishment? Oh, just 50 to 100 lashes. Nothing big or threatening at all. The bad streak would continue during the travels, when in August, just 3 months into the trip, a member of the Corps of Discovery would die. Sergeant Charles Floyd would die of appendicitis, but he would be the only member to die throughout the entire 2-year journey. In November, the Corps would get one of the most valuable members, Sacagawea. Sacagawea was originally of the Shoshone tribe, but was kidnapped at the age of 12 and then sold to a Canadian explorer to be his wife. When Sacagawea joined the Corps of Discovery, she was 21 and pregnant. She was a bilingual translator for the group and knew the rocky terrain and how to guide them through it. Having her with them gained credibility with Native American tribes as well. I mean, technically, it was Lewis and Clark's job to tell them that their land had been bought and belonged to the United States now. Obviously, this upset some Native Americans, but shockingly, Lewis and Clark had peaceful relations with dozens of tribes. In February of 1805, Sacagawea would give birth to a son. The journey would continue on with the tiny new member of the Corps. They would make their way through thousands of miles of land. For meat, they would kill elk and buffalo, but the men battled mosquitoes, gnats, ticks, and even snakes throughout their journey. Lewis once even took a 20-foot tumble and was accidentally shot in the ass. At one point, the men were thought for dead after not being heard from for over a year. In 1806, they would finally send a wagon back to Washington, D.C. with findings from their trip. They soon would return back home. In the 2-year and 4-month journey, the Corps traveled over 7,000 miles using boats, horses, and by foot. They explored the present-day states of Oregon, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Kansas, and Iowa. They would return home in September of 1806. And returned with 200 botanical samples and 120 animal specimens and valuable journal entries. The journey provided ecological, geographical, and cultural information about the previously uncharted terrain. They failed to identify a Northwest Passage water route due to it simply not existing. Keep wishing, Jefferson. But altogether, the expedition was a giant success. All in all, the expedition totaled $38,000. Lewis and Clark paved the way for Western expansion. Once they returned to St. Louis, the men wrote letters and shopped throughout the city. Each member of the Corps of Discovery received 320 acres of land, plus their monthly wages. Both Lewis and Clark would receive 1,600 acres of land. Both Sacagawea and York received nothing. York had expected to be a free man after the journey, but that was most certainly not the case. After asking Clark, Clark got offended and harsh, telling York that if he keeps persisting, he will send him to a more severe slave master. As for Sacagawea, she was perhaps the most valuable with the least recognition. There are varying stories on how her life played out. Some historians believe she died in 1812 at the age of 25 in South Dakota. Others believe she lived until her 90s and died in 1884 in Wyoming. Both states have tombstones for her, but I personally believe she passed away in 1812. The reason I believe this is because William Clark would go on to adopt and raise her children, and I don't believe he would have done so had she been alive. But in the end, she is remembered in history as quite the badass, and she even has more statues than any other woman in American history. As for Lewis and Clark, well, President Jefferson nominated Meriwether Lewis to be the governor of Upper Louisiana Territory. Clark was appointed the agent for Indian affairs in Louisiana. While governor, Lewis did a very mediocre job. He was ineffective and was struggling severely with his mental health. He would send vouchers to D.C. for expenses, and they began to get denied. Keep in mind, we had a new president in office. Thomas Jefferson, Lewis's pal, was out. James Madison was in. When these vouchers were getting denied, Lewis was the one responsible to pay them, so he decides to make the trip to Washington, D.C. because the stress is eating him alive. On October 10th, he decides to stop and sleep on his way to the Capitol. Around 3 a.m., he took his own life by gunshot. When Clark heard of his passing, he wrote his brother, "Oh, I fear the weight of his mind has overcame him." Lewis's headstone has Latin that reads, "I died too young, but my country will live out my life for me, and that we will." Lewis was only 35 when he died. Eventually, Clark would also become the governor of Upper Louisiana. He lived until the year of 1838, when he would die at 68 due to natural causes. I wasn't sure if I should hit on this, but I've gotten quite a few questions over the topic while researching. It's been said that Lewis and Clark had more than just a friendship, even lovers perhaps. I myself have heard this throughout the years and wanted to know the truth. After digging and diving into these men and their relationship, I can confidently say that it was platonic. Now, this is just my opinion, but I've simply not found anything to make me believe otherwise. As the years go by, we grow more curious to the sexuality of historic figures, but I truly didn't find any evidence supporting a romantic nature. But new days bring new insights and opinions, so I'm always open for discussion. That is my episode over Lewis and Clark and the Cora discovery. The journey they accomplished was groundbreaking for the United States. Nearly 200 years later, they're still remembered as heroes. I don't think that will ever change. Thank you all for listening. New episodes come out every Wednesday. Email me with any episode suggestions, comments, questions, or if you just want to talk history. My email is thechroniclesoftimepodcast@gmail.com. I'm your host, Rachel Payton, and you just listened to The Chronicles of Time.